Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into this absolutely fascinating essay by a Japanese writer who goes by the pen name TKN. We usually break down some pretty dense data here, but today, we're looking at something beautifully simple. We're talking about how one person used just the sheer power of imagination and storytelling to literally transform an atmosphere of paralyzing fear into lighthearted humor. It is such a brilliant reminder of how we can actually shape our own reality.
So it brings up a really serious question. How do you actually cure the anxiety of an approaching natural disaster? Think about it. When the sky has turned dark, the wind is howling outside, and the news is displaying this endless loop of warnings. That anxiety is primal, right? It's not something you can just logic your way out of. You can't just look at someone and go, hey, don't worry about that massive storm heading right for our house. It just doesn't work. But the source material we're exploring today presents this highly unconventional yet incredibly effective solution to this very universal human problem.
Okay, let's dive into this. The essay sets the scene on a very specific, incredibly tense day, June 27th. And the threat they're facing? It's entirely factual and very, very serious. Japan is staring down not just one, but two typhoons approaching the country at the exact same time. The author, who is the wife in this story, describes a day where even the air just feels totally unsettled by these looming rain clouds. She's checking the weather forecast constantly. She's looking out the window, her heart literally racing every single time she hits refresh on the updates. The anxiety is just palpable. She is absolutely dreading the worst-case scenario. I mean, what if both of these massive storms make landfall at the exact same time?
Well, by dinner time, the forecast shifts just a little bit, suggesting that maybe that absolute worst-case scenario of a double landfall might actually be avoided. The wife finally lets out a breath. But there is this stark divide in their living room. On one side, you have the wife's completely rational, very literal view of the situation. She's looking at the TV screen and she sees giant, swirling clouds of destruction. But then, on the other side, we have our husband's perspective. He is looking at the exact same radar image, and instead of a meteorological threat, he sees synchronized twin sisters dancing a waltz.
Which brings us to Section 1, the husband's special lecture.
So, the danger definitely hasn't completely passed, but the husband sees an opening here. He notices just how tense his wife is, and instead of offering those empty reassurances we talked about, he decides to completely hijack the evening's weather report. He basically takes on the persona of this quirky professor ready to deliver an impromptu masterclass right there in the living room. He kicks off his intervention by setting the stage with a little bit of meteorological trivia. He reminds his wife that historically, typhoons used to be given women's names, and this is a very deliberate move on his part. He's taking this massive, faceless, terrifying force of nature, and he's starting to personify it. He's giving the storms a human element, which, if you think about it, is the very first step in making them feel way less threatening. And then he drops this absolute gem of a quote on her. Just imagine sitting at your dinner table, stressed out of your mind about a natural disaster, and your partner turns to you, looks at the swirling vortexes on the TV, and says, Typhoon number 7, Makala, and Typhoon number 8, Hygos. They were good sisters, weren't they? But wife is understandably totally bewildered. Sisters? She's looking back at the television, trying to figure out where in the world he is seeing two sisters holding hands in a satellite image.
But the husband, he is fully committed to the bit. He says, now here is a question for you, and he just launches into the definitions of their names. He explains that Typhoon number 7, Makala, translates to Angel of Thunder. Now, as the wife points out in the essay, this makes perfect, logical sense for a storm. It sounds powerful, it sounds majestic, and a thunder angel naturally belongs up in the sky. It's a completely fitting title for a typhoon.
Now, what's really interesting about this next bit is the absolute absurdity of the second name. The husband reveals that Typhoon number 8, Hygos, translates to fig. Yes, literally the fruit. The wife writes that suddenly this terrifying weather report takes on the vibe of a local fruit market. I mean, how on earth are you supposed to react to a destructive storm named after a fig? The sheer comedic contrast of it completely short-circuits her anxiety. It is literally impossible to maintain a state of sheer terror when your brain is trying to process a deadly weather event named after a mildly sweet fruit.
So, having established our main characters, the Angel of Thunder and the fig, the husband starts building his narrative. What he's essentially doing here is giving a highly creative explanation of a real meteorological phenomenon known as the Fujiwara effect, which is where two cyclones interact. But he completely frames it as this beautiful story of cooperative sisterhood.
He explains that first, the weaker sister, the fig, arrived and just eagerly ate up all the warm water vapor. And because the fig ate all the vapor, the older sister, the angel of thunder, lost her energy. Finally, they approach each other, interfering with one another's paths and moving in this beautiful waltz that ultimately keeps both of them from making direct landfall. Sure, they brought heavy rain, but their perfect coordination saved the country from a direct hit.
He wraps up his lecture with this grand, dramatic flourish. He looks right at his wife and declares, mysterious synchronization, fateful unity. They're totally twins, right? And he says it with such absolute conviction that he entirely overwrites the grim reality of the weather broadcast. He basically built a completely new mythology right there in their living room.
Moving on to Section 2, Reframing the Fear.
We really need to analyze the underlying magic of what the husband actually accomplished here, because this isn't just a funny story. It is a profound example of emotional reframing. Obviously, he didn't change the weather, but he completely changed the environment inside their home using cognitive reappraisal. And the crazy thing is, his narrative actually worked. The wife writes that it was strange, but after hearing his passionate explanation, those terrifying swirling vortexes on the screen suddenly looked just a little bit noble. They transformed from this random act of violent nature into these brave, endearing sisters who deliberately danced away from the coast just to spare the people below. By attaching a story to the fear lost its sharpest edges.
So the crucial point here is that the wife, who is half exasperated but honestly entirely charmed at this point, realizes what is actually happening. She sees that her husband is intentionally taking a really scary event and turning it into an interesting, silly story. His true goal wasn't to teach her meteorology. Not at all. His goal was to brightly end a day that had been absolutely filled with anxiety for someone he loves. It's just this incredibly touching realization of his kind intentions.
Which leads us to Section 3, Praying to a Fig. But of course, the husband's incredibly vibrant imagination doesn't just stop because the storm is passing. We are now entering the comedic pivot of our story, where we get to see exactly where his priorities truly lie once his wife is safe and calm. The relief of avoiding a double typhoon landfall is massive. But man, the husband's focus shifts with whiplash-inducing speed. On one hand, you have surviving a major natural disaster. That's a pretty big deal. On the other, we see what immediately occupies his mental real estate the literal second the danger passes: the upcoming, highly anticipated Japan versus Brazil World Cup soccer match happening early next week.
And he seamlessly brings his newly created mythology right into his sports fandom. He actually puts his hands together to pray to the Typhoons for the soccer match. I'm not kidding. He says, "Angel of thunder, watch over us. Fig, I don't really get it, but cheer with us." The author notes that she has absolutely no idea if this counts as praying to the gods or praying to produce, but it is just completely hilarious. It perfectly caps off the evening, leaving her laughing softly beside him, just so grateful that they made it through the day safely.
And this brings us to the core takeaway of this explainer. We all face our own approaching storms, situations that make us feel entirely powerless and anxious. But as this husband showed us, while we cannot control the storm itself, we absolutely have the power to change the story we tell ourselves about it. So I want to leave you with this question. What scary event in your life right now could use a rewrite? Could a little imagination, a little humor, and maybe a supportive fig change the way you weather your next storm? Think about it. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer, and I will see you next time.